Welcome to another episode of my Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I get a taste of people. That's going to be a pun when I tell you who my guest is, but I get a taste of people and I want to find out more. And the finding out more, I want to do that in front of you, our listeners and our viewers, when some of these interviews go up on videos. So I'm really excited to have Dave Asprey as our guest today. And I mentioned something about a taste of him because you may have heard of the brand Bulletproof, Bulletproof coffee, Bulletproof foods. And he's the father of biohacking. He's the founder of Bulletproof 360. He's a four-time New York Times best-selling author. He's the host of the Webby award-winning podcast, Bulletproof Radio. And he's the creator of a global phenomenon, Bulletproof Coffee and the Bulletproof Diet. His background is he was kind of overweight, didn't particularly like himself, and he decided he'd do something about it. So he decided to chose not to just live, but then share what he found out so other people could live better lives. And he's spent decades scouring the planet from Tibet to the Andes, discovering and finding out what helps people reach their full human potential. And he transformed himself into a super high-performing human being himself. And there's much more about him, but I want to get into the podcast because we have a little limited time today. So I'll ask you, Dave, what I ask everyone, which is, if you were to step back and in your own fresh words, and it may not be fresh because you've probably said it many times, what matters most to you, and how did that come to matter to you? And we already have a taste of some of the wake-up calls, but since I'm a shrink, my audience often likes an origin story or two to find out if you want to be just like your parents or you want to be the opposite of them.
Oh God, right? Everyone falls into that trap until they know it's a trap. What matters most to me is not what mattered most to my parents, or the opposite of that. It's energy. It's how much energy do I have right now? Because in my world, energy is the currency of how you do anything. It's not time. It's do I feel the inner strength that powers willpower, that powers love, that powers continuous evolution of my consciousness as a human being? Because in my mid 20s, I made $6 million when I was 26 years old, back when $1 million meant something. And I lost it when I was 28. But during that time, I hit 300 pounds. I had arthritis in my knees, pre-diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, crippling brain fog, 15 years of antibiotic use because of chronic sinus infections. And I spent most of my day every day with the accelerator pedal all the way to the floor, trying to push harder while slowing down and hoping that I could hide it from everyone else. And I got to the point where I helped to build meaningful parts of cloud computing. I was a co-founder of a big late 90s internet company. And I just realized I couldn't hide it anymore. I bought disability insurance. And I said, if I can hack the internet, how hard could it be to hack my body? Because my doctor's not doing it for me. I started learning from my elders, people 3 times my age running an anti-aging group in Palo Alto who had more energy than I did, who would call me at 11:30 at night when they were 88 years old and saying, Dave, I'm so excited to have this new idea. And I'm like, how do they do that? And I learned the techniques of anti-aging from the pioneers in the field and realized these are not anti-aging techniques. These are energy techniques. This is the raw currency of what makes you human. And at this point, I've written enough books about energy. I've learned how to teach people to do it in their cells, that I've had the honor of being able to help gurus and shamans and sages turn up their energy. And universally, they say, oh my God, I can do what I do better with more ease. I started a neuroscience company focused on cognitive skills, focused on actually mystical skills, where people spend 5 days with the electrodes on their head, learning how to meditate faster than you could in a cave. And I've spent 6 months of my life doing that in order to be able to show up the way I do today. I had to get out of my own way biologically, emotionally, and spiritually. And that's why I do what I do every day.
Um, you remind me of some people I've had on the show that are incredibly impressive, and
Thank you.
uh, and it feels, and if I was listening to them, I'd be incredibly impressed. But then I'd run into thinking, it'll work for him. He has courage. He's perfect. He has it all together. Um, there's nothing that he could really get better at, as opposed to just refining, how great he's doing now. And I remember, I can share this with you. I remember I had Jay Abraham on the show.
Oh, a dear friend.
I figured he might be, and he was just brilliant. And and you and I have a little more time because I only called him on at 2/3 in the show, and I said, if I was you, I'd be impressed, and I'd say that'll work for you. That won't work for me. Jay, is there anything you could get better at? I mean, because it sounds like you have it all together. And he started laughing.
Yeah,
He couldn't stop laughing. He said, my mind is a hot mess. I mean, I love solving stuff. That's where I live. And so I'm just sharing that because, I mean, you may actually be superhuman, but my audience wants to be able to connect. So what could you get better at?
I hate to tell you, but I'm perfect in every way, and my ego. It looks like the audio just lagged there. Did it lag?
It lagged right at the right point. Maybe.
Okay, good. Let me try that more time.
I'm perfect in every way. I mean, that's what you said.
I also said my ego was smaller than yours, right? So here's the thing. I only did all this biohacking stuff because it was out of desperation and just self-interest. Like, I literally was up against the wall. I was going to lose my career because I couldn't remember anything. And I was falling asleep in meetings, even if I was biting my cheek and pinching myself until I had bruises. I could not turn my brain on. And I actually got a brain scan from Daniel Amen, who showed me that I had a hardware problem in my brain. I had parts of my brain that were damaged by toxins. It wasn't that I was a moral failing, which is what I thought. I can't lose this weight because I'm not trying hard enough. This 90 minutes a day in the gym, 6 days a week, I'm probably eating too much lettuce. So I had this really big, not good enough thing going on. And what I realized there was it wasn't from trying. It was in part from not having enough energy, because energy is what drives trying, but it was also just from having bad information. So I would say I probably have different abilities than you, Mark. And everyone who's here who figures out their mission has whatever their abilities are. And if you study yogic siddhis, which is about 40 something documented unusual abilities of a few humans, not everyone has access to all of those unless they're fully enlightened. And I don't think I am. I'm certainly not Buddha or Jesus or anyone like that. I have no aspirations to be that. So that said, do I have some abilities in my brain? Yes. That might make me able to name things or create stuff. I can have ideas like Jay, a mile a minute. It's not a problem. However, if you hired me to execute on any of those ideas, I would fire me. I am a terrible executor, right? Like I am fundamentally bad at that. So my hat goes off to my executive assistant who has superpowers that are unfathomable to me. What I have done that everyone listening can do is I finally got the message, usually from my elders, in this case from Dan Sullivan, who runs Strategic Coach. And look, stop trying to fill in my weaknesses. Focus on my strengths and ask for and receive help for the things that are not my gifts. And everyone listening can do that. And that's what I did. For me, the hard part, though, the thing that slowed me down the most, I grew up, speaking of family of origin stuff, believing that if you asked for help, it was a sign of weakness. And if you asked for help, it would create an obligation that you had to fulfill. No one taught me, and I didn't figure this out until much later in life, that when you ask for help, it's an act of service for the other person. You are allowing them to be helpful to another human, and that feels good. It puts us in a flow state. And if when in my mid 20s, I'm the first guy to sell anything over the internet. I sold a caffeine t-shirt out of my dorm room before e-commerce had a name. And this was in Entrepreneur Magazine. I'm 22 years old. I just found a picture from that era. Oh my God, I was very large. And at the same time, Mark Andreessen was making the first web browser. And about 2 years later, a guy named Jeff Bezos was thinking about doing e-commerce for books, which is an idea I had when I worked in a warehouse about the same time. Well, even Mark Zuckerberg, who came along later, Mark went to his elders, Sheryl Sandberg, and said, I need help. And Mark went to the CEO of Sun Microsystems and said, I need help. And me, I said, I am never going to ask for help. I'm good enough. I know everything. And so they're both multi-billionaires, and I'm not. I'm not doing bad. I'm not complaining here. I've launched a company that's, does hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, whatever. But they are far ahead in their careers because they had that message about asking for help for their weaknesses. I didn't get that until later in life. Anyone listening, I don't care if you're 16, I don't care if you're 56. Ask for help is step one. Step two, and this is the hard part for me, is to actually receive the help. Because you can ask for it and then be resistant to it. And when you learn to actually receive it with gratitude, and gratitude is a specific skill that you can train with neuroscience, then things open up and you're actually helping other people by letting them help you. And this is one of the few examples where you can violate the law of conservation of energy, where you create more energy in both sides of that equation.
So if you were to, have you completely erased the limited belief about asking for help? I mean, or is that still a part of your nature? And as you look into your future, if you look in your future and say, something that wouldn't surprise me that in the next year or two, I'll be asking for help with is what?
My model of reality says that if you're unaware of something, it is invisible to you because you have filters installed by your parents or society or just by Mother Nature, or sometimes generational traumas, all kinds of stuff. So if I had something like that, by definition, I would be unaware of it. And so would you, and so would everyone. And there's about a half a second gap between when something happens and when you become aware of it. And we can measure that gap. And I've actually narrowed my gap. So I have the same gap as an 18-year-old instead of an average 49-year-old. But it's still there. So I couldn't answer that honestly. And if I did, it would be an egoic act. So there almost certainly is something in there, but I don't know that it's in there. And I would be unable to perceive it unless I had good friends or a therapist or maybe some technology that helped me know when that was going on.
I want to run something by you. I had Chip Conley on the podcast.
Chip's great.
Chip is great. And Joie de Vivre Hotels, pivoted to Airbnb, pivoted again to Modern Elder Academy because 5 of his friends died by suicide. And he realized that he was addicted to achievement.
Yeah, it's a problem. I had dinner with Chip, one of his and he's doing good work in the world. I don't think I'm addicted to achievement. I am a disruptor. I've been a disruptor in Silicon Valley my whole life. I am a computer hacker and a hacker of every kind of system. And I get I will call it a perverse pleasure from seeing inefficient, dumb systems fall under their own weight and be replaced by something better, something evolutionary. So that's kind of been my role. And I don't think it's an addiction. It's sort of like being addicted to exercise. Well, if you stop exercising, you don't feel as good. So then you exercise again, but that would be the definition of addiction. So the question is my work in the world satisfying and fun for me? And is it worthy? Not worthy being judged by others, but just, was it worth the work it was? But given that creating new ideas and making them come into the world, I want to keep doing that. That keeps me young. What I don't want to do is keep managing people, because actually I kind of suck at that. I'm good at leadership and I'm bad at management. I also have the habit of asking for help from people who are narcissists or sociopaths. And I've had so much economic damage and damage to my teams and leadership from hiring the wrong people because I'm excited, because I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So part of my path has been developing discernment, so that the real thing is not just, can't you ask for help? Can you ask for and receive help from the right people? The people who are going to make a win-win situation, instead of a situation where they win and you lose and you find out later. So I probably have some trauma to work through on that, from multiple companies, but I'm getting better at that. I'm also getting better at finding people who are better than me at that. I may never be a great judge of character because I have other stuff to do. I just want to hire someone who's a good judge of character, and rely on them as a partner. And I think that model is better. I don't have to be great at everything. I have to be great at the stuff that only I can do.
Something I shared with Chip, I'll run it by you and you can say, nope, nope, that doesn't fit. But uh, now he did admit that he was addicted to achievement, but he reached a point where he felt that he was still capable of deep depression. And as I said, 5 of his friends died by suicide. And so in the interview, I said, is it possible that you have the syndrome of disavowed yearning? And he said, what the F is that? And I said, is it possible that you have a concept of what wholeness means, and when you're whole, you walk into the future as opposed to running into it? And if the syndrome of disavowed yearning is that at a very young age, there was a perception of something missing that would have helped you feel whole and more at peace and maybe not have to eat so much. But if you disavow needing it and pivot into achievement, you can go 50 years and say, ain't this cool? But if there's still something nagging at you, then maybe what happened is you coped magnificently by disavowing that you needed something at a young age, which would have maybe helped you to feel more whole so that you could walk into the future instead of running into it and partially running away from this disavowed yearning,
Wow.
and he sort of got it. And, we finished the podcast, and then he really got it a few months later. He wrote a blog at the Modern Elder Academy. So I'm just sharing that because one of the things that I do is I not only a suicide prevention specialist, but I've done house calls to dying patients who are trying to find peace at the end of their life, and often they've run into a point where they say, I might have outsmarted myself. There was one person, I can't mention his name, but very famous, very beloved in public. Private life is shambles, multiple marriages, trust fund kids, kids on drugs and everything, but loved in public. And I remember I was seeing him, and I said, you look like shit, and I don't think it's because you're dying. You've been dying as long as I've known you. What's up? He said, I don't think I've done anything important. I said, what?
Wow.
You got a hospital named after you? You got such and such? And he looked at me, and he was also beloved in public for his humor. And he said, don't con a con man, especially when he's dying. I've got all the love. I've got all the love that money can buy. And that's all it's worth.
Loneliness.
And here was the last thing he said, but then I'll let go of it, and you can say, I don't know who the fuck you're talking about, Mark, but or the syndrome. And he said, what I've discovered is that everything I thought was unimportant is important, and everything I thought was important is unimportant. And I like fixing things, and I've run out of time. So, when you're in a fortunate position to do house calls to these people to help them make peace with themselves, you leave those house calls saying, Mark, there's a lesson to be learned here, Mark. Make sure you learn it. So I'm just sharing some of these things because I had someone on the podcast, and is it okay that I'm sharing this stuff with you?
This is super helpful. I'm looking to learn, and clearly you are my elder and you have a lot of wisdom, so do share.
So I had someone on the podcast who I really like, and I think he could really have an impact on the world. And when I decided that I liked him enormously and I wanted him to have that impact, I said, can I make an observation, because you're really successful but you could be much more. And I said, you're much more forceful than you are formidable.
Mm.
And I said, the problem with being forceful is it's a nice, almost hypomanic energy, but you cause other people to have to do what you're doing from being forceful. Whereas when you're formidable, you stand for something, you put a stake in the ground, not for your own future, but the future of the world, and you defend it. And when you're formidable, you just step into that space and you attract people towards you. And it's a different energy than being forceful.
It is so cool that you're talking about these subtle shifts in energy. I, I'm still working on that. And I've had the honor of looking at the brainwaves of 1,500 high performing entrepreneur types who've been through my 40 years of Zen program,
Mm.
and talking with them almost universally, especially the men, about how childhood traumas, whether it's parental or bullying, has powered their entrepreneurial success, which is that forceful energy. That's the what do you do when you're bullied? You learn one way or another how to do it back. And certainly I dealt with that. The childhood experiences like that can all be rewritten in various types of therapy, whether it's transpersonal psychology, EMDR, rebirthing, holotropic breathing. I have spent great amounts of time doing that. I've been to Nepal, Tibet, to learn meditation from the masters, the Andes, all over the place from multiple lineages to try and unwrap that part of me and to build a worthy model to be able to get myself and others to those states very quickly to do the deep work. But it feels like there's always more to do. And I've actually been doing the shift you're talking about right now just over the last couple of years. I'm not on the board of or running Bulletproof anymore. It hasn't been sold. And just being able to sit and be formidable or just be peaceful. Even my new coffee brand is called Danger Coffee. And the idea is not because we want people to be dangerous, except the definition of danger is I'm full of power and I choose to be peaceful. But someone who's full of power is inherently dangerous because they could do anything, even in the face of evil, even in the face of stress, even in the face of a challenge, but a worthy challenge, versus the world that I'm concerned we're building, which is where we're peaceful because we're all too tired and weak to do anything else. And I don't want to go back to that because I feel like that was me, as just an exhausted young person where there was too much emotional stress. There was not enough biological energy and health. And I feel like if we can just tick people's health up a little bit, that gives them enough power to do this self-reflection, to look at themselves in the mirror and see, what's going on in there and maybe just make a few changes. But I don't want anyone to try to do what I do. I'm not wired like most people. And if I lived your life or someone else's life, I would probably be miserable. And if they try to lead my life, they'd be miserable. The question is, am I more forceful than I should be? Sometimes I'm sure I am. Other times, maybe I'm not forceful enough or formidable enough. What I think happens to senior executives, and especially CEOs like me, like Chip, like his friend, it's one of the loneliest things you could ever do. And we exalt this. We say, oh, when I'm CEO, I'll be happy. But what they don't tell you is that when you're CEO, it is not your job. In fact, it is going against your job to treat your employees like your peers because it disrupts leadership in a very fundamental biological way. These are your people, they're your partners, they're your team, but you're the team leader and you can always fire them and they can't fire you. And that is a fact. So you get a sense of loneliness because you can't always be your authentic self because it disrupts people. So then you're like, oh my God, who can I be myself with? Well, is it your partner at home? Maybe if they can handle it. If you did a great job at selecting a partner and they evolved with you. So what CEOs end up doing is, well, like Modern Elder, I spend probably $100,000 a year on different networking groups for other CEOs so I can sit down over dinner with people who understand my life, because it is a tiny 0.00001% of the population, because very few people are in leadership like that. And we need a place to vent. This is why groups like YPO exist. And this is why people say, why would you spend $10,000 to go to that event? I'm like, because I can relax and I can talk about the stuff that other people don't understand. I can't go to my neighbors because that is intimidating or it's boring, because they get what you talked about earlier, that, oh my God, it's exhausting. If I try to be you, I feel like I should be you. No, they should be them. But if I show up as myself and I run at my full speed and I turn everything on, it's blinding. So you got to be around people who can handle your wattage level, and that's hard.
Are you running away from the 300-pound kid you were?
Nah, not anymore. I really feel like I've done that work on the 300 pounds thing because I didn't care that much about the weight. What I cared about was the exhaustion. And I'll tell you straight up, I will never go back to that because I have the tools to not do it. And it's like walking around in a room where the dimmer switch is all the way set to dim and you're trying to read. Like, man, I could maybe make out some of these things. But if you live your life like that every day, it's exhausting and miserable. And I'm not going to go back to being sick. And I will spend all of my money and all of my time to make sure I don't do that. But I am more resilient now than I was before. I can do lots of things that I wouldn't have been able to handle back then, and I continue to get better. So is that running away from, or is that just rational action? I don't know. I'm sure that there's some emotional, I will never go back to that. If I was fully enlightened, I could just peacefully, go back into that brain fog and emotional reactivity all day long. I just don't want to.
I'm not suggesting that you do that, but as I'm listening to you,
It's interesting, Mark. Keep going. You're not going to offend.
inside that 300-pound exhausted, arthritis everywhere. You may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because there's a part of probably at its worst, there's a part of him that felt horrendous, horrible,
Oh yeah.
and needed. It's kind of like that video I showed you before this, and the listeners don't know what we're talking about, but uh, they needed someone to connect with them, so that they could lean into something and just kind of exhale from the inside.
I know what you're talking about there.
I'll tell you, someone I'm doing the suicide prevention work. And so someone I've become friends with, and we did a documentary together, is Kevin Hines. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived.
Mm-hmm.
I had him on my podcast. I was on his podcast, and I forget which one. And I had him go back to the moment that he jumped over the rails. And he said, I got there, and he said, look, I was dealing with a mental disorder. I had voices telling me, kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself. But I got to the railing, and I said, I don't know if I want to do this. I just want someone to see me. I just want someone to just stop. And he said, there was one person that came up to him, and he thought, oh, this person's going to help me. And the person said, could you take my picture? It was a tourist. And after he took the picture, he jumped over the railing. And then as soon as he got over the rails, in a nanosecond, the anticipatory relief that death would give him gave him a little clarity. And he realized, as soon as I went over the rails, I realized this is the biggest mistake I could have ever made. And he folded himself into a ball, and so he didn't die when he hit the water in some miraculous thing. But on the podcast, again, it's a little bit therapy without asking. I had him go back, and I said, I'd like to be that person that you were looking for just before you went over the rails. And what would I see in your eyes just before you went over the rails? And then what happened, we did this sort of visualization where I said, why don't we just sort of sit down? And there we were
Hmm.
seated with our backs against the Golden Gate Bridge rails, and it was just uh, it was. There's a term I've come up with that I've used to prevent suicide called surgical empathy.
Mm.
And the idea being is that when we're really traumatized, we form psychological adhesions, not attachments, but adhesions. And one of the adhesions is to death because it'll take all the pain away.
Or
And that,
addiction. Very similar,
or
right?
addiction, or
Yeah.
addiction. So your addiction, death, it feels you. You feel felt by it, takes the pain away. But with surgical empathy, when you can feel felt by another person in just the right acute way, you may let go of death as the only way to feel less alone in hell. And what happens is when you feel that, you just start to cry. And when I
Yeah.
did the visualization with Kevin, I we just saw each other sitting there, and then at one point he just collapsed into my shoulder. And
Yeah.
again, this probably has nothing to do with you, or it might have a little bit, but you have so much to give the world. Uh, uh, you could be more formidable, and I think if you found that formidable thing, you would walk into the future and attract everything you want and attract that energy. It would be the real rules of attraction, or whatever the hell that book was that sold 10 million copies.
The
Uh,
secret.
the secret. But
I appreciate that,
that
Mark.
could be
I'm
you. That
looking
could be
for
you.
the recipe to make that shift. And yeah, I don't talk about that a lot on my show or anything, but I have some of the most powerful spiritual guru people that I am aware of on the planet who of their own accord just help me sometimes on stuff like that, and they're all working with me on that, and I'm so grateful for that kind of support. It's a hard transition because it's like going to a place that you haven't been, where there isn't a map, and you don't know what it feels like. And I've learned how to train a lot of the places I've been, because with computers, you can actually show people a feeling that you can't describe with words. And that's helped me a lot. But this little transition there, God knows how much trauma healing work, energetic stuff. I mean, all the whole tool set's available. It's hard work. And one of the things I've learned that I didn't believe when I was younger, the American way, the radical self-reliance, even the Burning Man, speaking of Chip, radical self-reliance, that's a bunch of BS. You do not do the higher stages of transformational spiritual evolution by yourself. You do them with your mighty companions, with other people who show up for you, who will help to carry you when you don't know how to do it. And this is how we help each other. This is how we serve at the highest level. So I'm working on that stuff, and I appreciate
So
your
here,
ability even to see it.
so I appreciate you allowing me because I just see it. Here's where I think the next work for you is,
Do tell.
and it's coming from a voice inside you, and you can, and I'll try and channel my inner Dave, and you can say that's not it at all, but it's coming in clear, and what it's saying to me is, Mark, I know how to ask, I don't know how to surrender,
Uh,
and it's exhausting,
it is.
and 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 I know intellectually, I know what the word means, and I'm exhausted. I mean, I'll keep going, and asking is certainly a step in the right direction, but I just don't know how to surrender control. And maybe that's why people do psychedelics, because you're obviously surrendering control. You go through a sort of a therapeutic psychosis. You have a shaman or a therapist say, no, no, the diarrhea and the vomiting is all part of it. You're deconstructing. You're like a Rubik's cube that had the wrong combination. And when you get on the other side, your Rubik's cube is going to be organic. It's going to be foolproof. It's going to be cool. And I think that's part of the appeal of psychedelics is people get to give up control with the hope and belief that on the other side they'll organically come together.
Wow.
but I'm just throwing that out at you because I just feel the energy mixed with the exhaustion that it's so counter to your intellect, but I feel this ache to just surrender, whatever the hell that means.
It it's interesting. I'm listening probably for the fifth time to David Hawkins' book "Letting Go," which is a really powerful book about surrender.
Hmm.
And I have various practices where you can work on surrender and letting go and relaxing, but it's not a natural state for me. It's not one that I know. So it's sort of experimenting and grasping at ways that you can fully surrender, and it's been a challenge. We'll put it that way. And it's one of those things. I think that's part of evolution. I don't know that it's something that most people just maybe we're all born doing it naturally, except for me. I just wouldn't know. But I'm grateful to have your support and to have other people supporting me as I figured that part out. Because if you want to be an enlightened leader, who does the things that you want to do, it seems like a really useful
Oh, yeah.
and relaxing skill, but I don't have it all the way. It's a lot better than it used to be, but it's not there. I'll get you. I'll grant you that.
I don't know that I don't think this applies to you, but it might. I'm at the beginning stage of working with someone who had a great career, and then he discovered he was bipolar too.
Oh wow.
And and when he was on a roll, he was smarter than everyone, and he had a certain arrogance. But then everything fell apart. Two divorces, and he says, my kids are still young, and they're going to get a good dad. And uh, we're thinking of collaborating because he's saying, Mark, I'm not alone in this kind of thing. When you have that hypomanic energy, it is wonderful. And when you can mix it with good judgment, you could do amazing things. But there's a body count that you leave behind you,
Mm-hmm.
and and we become like brothers. I love this guy. He says, my kids didn't bargain for this, and so and I occasionally need to take meds for bipolar, and I hate them, but my kids didn't bargain for this. So we may be doing something, and then we'll reach out to people who can resonate with it because he said it's really common, and mental illness is not really talked about by the most successful people.
It's really common that successful people have unusual brains.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because I have a normative database of unusual performers, and it doesn't look like the standard EEG, the quantitative EEG models that we use. If you get a sample of 100,000 people's brains, it's like a perfectly average brain. The people who do the kind of things that gets you in CEO roles or major influencer in art or entertainment or whatever, they're standard deviations away from normal. And quite often that's in a way that gives them a gift, but it can bring with it the flip side of that, which, as you're talking about, there could be a mental illness. ADHD is excessively common. I had it. Heck, I used to have Asperger's syndrome when I was a kid. I had OCD and ODD, and it runs in my family. I mean, my grandmother's a PhD nuclear engineer.
Mm.
And it's there. So the hyper rationality and the lack of bodily awareness, I've gone through and retrained all that because I found out there was a signal in all the noise that is my biology. And being able to see it in so many other people, it almost feels like quite often comes some other burden. And I'm not saying that I'm, super great. I've achieved a lot in my life, but achievement is, it doesn't make you happy is all I can say.
No, I understand. Anyway,
Yeah.
look, I want to thank you for your time and allowing the conversation to go wherever it went.
Well, Mark, thank you for your vision. Clearly, you're reading some energetic stuff that most people don't do. And I recognize that in you. And thank you for sharing what you see with me.
Well, I just see so much. And hopefully we'll continue a conversation.
Love to.
I know you're really busy, but where can people find out? I guess they just have to look up Bulletproof and they'll.
You'll find me, or the Human Upgrade is my podcast. I renamed it because it's about just upgrading humanity in general, including myself. Because I kind of think we're due for that, so we can take better care of each other and the planet and stuff like that. So the Human Upgrade is where you find me.
Well, and if you're listening in, uh, it's a I wouldn't say a better podcast than this one, but it's a great podcast, The Human Upgrade. So make sure you check it out and check out what Dave's up to and follow his journey. Uh, he's a lifelong learner. He's open to being challenged. There are times when he doesn't like it, but he hungers for it. And I think he's going to find it. I think he's going to find it. So thank you, Dave, and thank you for listening in, whoever's listening in, and please share this with people who you think might get something from it. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Mark.